Good morning, everyone. Thanks for coming so early. Well, it's early for me. So I'm still on mountain time. Um, I'm excited to be here to talk about a recent paper that I think was published just last week. So you can change impress to 2019. And this is a paper that was accepted into Children and Youth Services Review based on some work that I was doing with my colleagues Zainab Burnjan and Sadie Later-Elder. So before we get started talking about prevalence, I think it's really important to make a distinction between behaviors and outcomes. As most of you in this room know, parental alienating behaviors are those behaviors that are enacted, or clusters of behaviors enacted over time to harm the relationship between the child and another parent. Now, parental alienation itself is more of an outcome, so this is the outcome of being exposed to these behaviors, and it could be due to a lot of reasons as well. It could be due to also involvement of third parties and other things that you saw Mandy talk about. Now, we know that not all children are alienated who are exposed to alienating behaviors, as I know, Amy, I think you talked about that yesterday. And there could be a lot of reasons for this, right? There could be psychological resilience of the child. There could be appropriate clinical intervention or legal intervention that occurs. There could be a strong positive relationship prior to it that somehow buffers the child. So there's a lot of factors that contribute to whether or not a child will become alienated. And some children aren't even aware of all the shenanigans that are going on, right? The alienating parent might be texting hostile messages, and the child has no clue about what's happening behind the scenes. And so the child could be directly or indirectly affected by these behaviors. Now, I say this because when people ask how common is alienation, you can see it's complex, because we're talking about how common are these behaviors and how common or how prevalent is the outcome. I'm going to give you results here of 3 representative national polls that we conducted in the US and Canada to help give you at least some, I think, are pretty good estimates of both of these. So how many of you have heard the term 22 million American adults are alien? Okay. That came from my study that was published in 2016. In that study, these kinds of studies are very expensive to do in order to get samples that are representative. And so I had the good fortune to work with a colleague, my colleague Sadie Later-Elder, to add 5 questions to a poll that they were conducting in North Carolina that was representative. It was a telephone poll using cell phone and landlines where people were randomly selected to participate. And so we could then make estimates from that of how common people felt they were being alienated. And of that, we found 13.5% said that they felt they were being alienated from their child by the other parent, and that's about 9% of the general population of that state, which allows us to extrapolate to the national population of 22 million. That's how we came to that number. And what's important is we didn't find gender differences or any other demographic differences. Moms and dads were just as likely to feel they were being alienated. Now this sample was drawn from a North Carolina sample. And so my question was, does this replicate to the entire country? And is it similar in another country north of us, in Canada? So we conducted 2 polls, first of all, using Qualtrics, which is a web-based survey administration system that provides and can provide to researchers panels of participants who reflect a population. Now, you may say, how are panels better than random telephone sampling? The panels are used frequently by market researchers, scientific researchers, and they're used to inform policy decisions at national levels because you can make these panels represent the population. Now, one problem with telephone surveys is even though people might be randomly selected to be in the study, you don't know who actually agrees to be in the study. So who actually agrees to answer your surveys may not actually reflect the population. So the panel allows you to actually have a better estimate and reflect the actual population. And so we asked so Qualtrics, what they do is they work with very large market research firms to identify participants that reflect whatever the researcher wants. So if they want a certain percentage of gender or race, they can pull that together into their panel. So we paid for this survey using money that we raised from a GoFundMe campaign. And so we had a lot of very generous small donations and a couple larger donations to help pay for the first sample. And then there was an alienated mother from Canada who donated the money for the Canadian sample because she wanted to see if it replicated there. Now, because the survey was administered online, we could also ask a lot more questions. So in the first study, we could only ask 5. And in the second, so in these studies, we could ask a lot more, and we could provide more response options. So rather than just saying, do you feel like you've been alienated, or, you know, how severe, you can only ask a couple questions. Like here at online, you can ask, 5 response options and other things. So it allows more variability in the data. Okay, so we had 600 people from each country in our sample. And what did we find? For this first study, the intent was just to replicate what we had in our previous 2016 study. So we found that 2 samples, a greater percentage of parents, you can see 17% in the US and about 11% in Canada, feel that they're the targets of alienating behaviors. So this puts the estimate at about 40 million in the US and over 3 million in Canada, because their population is smaller than the US. So our third poll, we wanted to build off of these first 2 in order to focus exclusively on people who had a child with someone that they're no longer in a relationship with. So they may or may not have been married, they could be divorced or just separated, but they have a child and they're no longer with the other parent. And the panel was again selected to represent the US population, and so we can generalize to it. And this poll was a lot more expensive to do because we had a very much more particular sample, and we asked a question about suicide, which put the poll, they considered it higher risk, so it cost a lot more to do this. So I was able to get a internal grant from my university through the College of Natural Sciences and the psychology department to pay for this poll. We had 669 people in this sample. And in the first study, we only asked a yes/no question. Do you feel the other parent was engaging in alienating behaviors? And we gave some examples, and people answered yes or no. But so in the third poll, we approached this differently. We gave people 18 commonly used alienating behaviors from some of Amy Baker's work and others. And we asked people to check off whether they've done those behaviors and the other parent has done those behaviors. So we could get a kind of a continuous variable of how many behaviors these parents were admitting to do and that the other parent has been doing. And in research that I've published and others have published, people are willing to admit that they've done these behaviors, especially alienators, because they feel totally justified in doing what they're doing, right? Now, over half the sample reported that the other parent has done at least 7 of these behaviors. So we had this checklist of self and other. And then at the very end of the survey, we asked them the yes/no question that we had from the first study. Because this would allow us to say, well, a lot of people think they're being alienated, but they're actually not. And there's a lot of people who are being alienated, or they're targets of a lot of these behaviors, and they don't know what to call it. Right? They don't. So this allowed us to look at that. So we asked these questions at 2 very different points of the survey, and we can compare these. And so what did we find? So again, at the end of the survey, we asked people yes or no, do you feel like you're being alienated? And in this case, about 39% of the parents said that they felt that they were. Now this is obviously higher than the other one because we're looking at parents who are no longer in a relationship with the other person. Whereas in the other 2 samples, these are parents who are maybe still together with the parent or not. So these are people who have actually broken up. Now the question we have next then, are people accurate in their reporting of this? And so we took people who had high levels of alienating behaviors that the other parent was doing. So at the 75th, we took the continuum of the the variable, and we took it at the 75th quartile or percentile, so people high levels of alienating behaviors and people at the lower levels at 25 percentile, and we compared them to whether they said yes or no. And so for people who said that they're not alienated, about 86% of them reported that the person actually engaged in 7 or more alienating behaviors. So that's a lot of people who were experiencing alienating behaviors but said, no, I'm not. I'm not the target of these behaviors. And the yes-no question. Now, in contrast, among the people who said that they were the targets of alienating behaviors, about 70% of them reported 1 or less, 1 or 0 actual behaviors. So they didn't, they said that they were alienated, or they felt that they were, but they actually were not experiencing a lot of behaviors. So these inaccuracies here, I think, really indicate that there's a lot of people who just don't know what alienation is or what alienating behaviors are. And there's a lot of variability there. Now, if we look at parents who are experiencing 7 or more alienating behaviors, that's about 30 million people in the U.S. Okay. So what about alienation of the children? Assessing parental alienation is challenging because it often requires clinical assessment, and you need to kind of really get a full family diagnostic on the family. And researchers have had to rely on probability estimates of trying to determine how many kids actually become alienated. And so I know Bill Burnett and Rick Warshak have done that through deductive reasoning by saying, you know, there's so many families that are divorced and considered high conflict. And that by doing that, they were able to come to this kind of estimation of about 1% of children are alienated from a parental figure to some degree. So although it wasn't an ideal assessment, in our first 2 polls, we did ask people whether they thought that the behaviors the other parent had been doing actually resulted in a damaged relationship with their child. And so we found that of the U.S. parents, about 66% of them felt it did, and of the Canadian, about 61%. And you can see the total numbers then that is generalized too in those populations. So if we estimate what that means for children, it's probably about 30 million Americans and 2 million Canadians. Now, we only asked about 1 child. We didn't ask about multiple children. So if there are siblings that are also alienated, it could be higher than that. Now, like the first 2 polls, that was just like the other question that we asked. In this one, it was just a yes/no. So for the third poll, we used a different measure. We used a measure by Gina Rowland, the Parental Alienation Scale, which was developed or published last year. It's 42 items that tap into the symptoms that we commonly see in alienated children, the 8 kind of manifestations that we often see. And so parents answered questions about, and they were asked to pick the 1 child in their family that they feel most alienated from, or have the most problems with, or they're not as close to. And so they didn't answer for multiple children. So we only have data for 1. And then at the very end, we also asked them this yes/no question. So we can look at accuracies, like do they feel like they're alienated from their child? And what's their rating on this measure? Okay. And what we found, the question that they were asked at the end, about 27% felt that the behaviors that they were experiencing actually affected their relationship with their child in a negative way. They felt they were being alienated or had been alienated. And so now the question is this accurate? So if we look at the high and low responses on the measure, so people who are high on the alienation measure that we had, and people who were low, how do they map onto this belief that they've been alienated or not? And what we found for those parents who felt that they had been successfully alienated from a child, about 88.5% actually were high on that scale. So the high level of symptoms that they were seeing in their child actually indicated that their perceptions of being alienated were accurate. Now, of the 203 people who didn't think that they were alienated from a child, about 32% of them scored high on that measure. So there were about 32% of people who said, I'm not, but yet their children were alienated. but about 70% of them actually were pretty low on that measure. So these findings mean that people are generally a little bit more accurate about whether their kids have been alienated or not. They're a little bit less accurate about the behaviors that they're the targets of. Okay. So if a parent says they've been alienated from a child, they're more correct, usually, or more accurate, it seems, with this kind of measure. Okay. So what does this mean for prevalence in the U.S.? What this third poll tells us about prevalence is that if we just look at the single item, yes, no question, that's about 13 million people who feel they've been alienated from at least one child. If we use the measure, the Rowland's measure that I had, it's about 6.7% of the sample. And so that is about, for at least one child, that's about 4 million children in the U.S., and that's about 1.3% of the U.S. population. Now, to give that figure some perspective, that's 3 times as many children as have autism in the U.S. Now, I'm sure many of you have heard this claim that parents who are alienated are reciprocating alienating behaviors, right? That they're both doing it, that they're both responsible for the problem. Both people must be doing something wrong. We can't just blame one person. But is that true? So we can start answering that question with the data that I have in this study, in this third poll. And so to look at this, we took that checklist of 18 behaviors about whether people said that they've done that and their exes done that. And we eliminated people who said, I don't do any of those things and neither does my ex. And that was only 11.2% of the sample. So those are the people who are getting along great. Lucky them, right? Now, if a person reported doing more than twice as many behaviors as the other person, then they were labeled or categorized as a alienating parent. If the persons admitted to doing equal numbers, then they were the reciprocating parents. And then if we had parents who said that I'm doing a couple, but my ex is doing a lot more, at least twice as many or more as me, they were labeled targeted parents, or the alienated parents. And so what we found was that this characterized about the sample in this way. There were about 13% of people who admitted to being a primary perpetrator of these behaviors. I'm sure that's an underestimate because there's some self-reporting, but there's a lot of people who still admit to doing it. About half the sample were what we would call reciprocating parents. So they were admitting to doing the same number or around the same number as the other parent. And about 40% said that they were the primary targets and that the other person was perpetrating a lot of these behaviors. And what's interesting is I don't report this, it's in my paper, but we find that these people, the reciprocating parents, had the least hostility towards their exes, which matches what Mandy just said, that a lot of targeted parents don't have that animosity and things. It's the reciprocating parents. Is this a red? No, I don't know if there's a point. Yeah. It's the reciprocating parents that are the highest in the hostility towards their exes. Now, when we estimate this to the general population, well, that puts us at about 22 million. So that actually is a replication of our 2016 study. These are 22 million adults in the U.S. who are not reciprocating the alienating behaviors. Now, who is more likely to be alienated of these groups if we use that measure? The graph here shows that scores on the Rowland's measure, and the means are transformed because it's non-normative data, which is common in this kind of data, so it's transformed. But what you can see is there's statistically significant differences among the groups. And on the left, you can see that is, I don't know why it came out as a comma. It should be a dot. Sorry. You can see here the alienating parents, the ones who were perpetrating the majority of the behaviors, were the least alienated from their children. So the symptoms towards them were positive, right? These kids are not rejecting them. They're not doing the things that we see with alienated children. On the right, you can see the reciprocating parent is also less likely to be alienated from their child. In the middle, you can see the targeted parent is the one who's most alienated. And I think is Nick here, Nick Child? Yeah, I think we were discussing yesterday, well, does this mean that the reciprocating, you should start reciprocating behaviors, right? To prevent your kid from being alienated. I don't think that's what this is saying at all, because that's bad too, right? But we didn't measure what those outcomes are for those kids in those loyalty conflicts. That's a different dynamic. We didn't measure that. So, and those outcomes aren't good either. But what we're talking about here is this is what we see. And I think what's important with this is that we can differentiate between children, and it lends support to the idea that we can differentiate between children who are experiencing loyalty conflicts and alienation. We can do that, and this data can kind of can point to that. Okay. How about impact? So, what impact does all this have on the targeted parent? Oh, yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
I agree that it's not good for a targeted parent to behave, to reciprocate because it damages the kids. So I agree with what you just said, but doesn't your statistics show that if a parent is willing, a targeted parent is willing to fuck up their kids as well, they're less likely to end up completely the loser?
That's, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
Well, I mean, I tried it and it failed. And my kid is at Colorado State University in the psychology department, and I'm a targeted parent.
Mm-hmm.
And I've asked for help, and I don't get it.
Right.
I don't get it in the department. I don't get it in all of them. Once I get maybe crickets.
Yeah.
So what
Yep.
does the data show?
Well, the data, I don't know, we didn't measure what that ultimately would be for in the long term for that parent, right? And what the outcome would be for the parent-child relationship over time. We don't have that data. So, mm-hmm. Right. That's what it's pointing to, yes. However, we didn't measure the kinds of outcomes that you would see for kids who are experiencing loyalty conflicts to see how bad it is for them. Either way, the alienating behaviors are very abusive. And so, yeah, yeah. It's just different symptoms. Yeah, you're going to see different symptoms. Well, actually, a lot of children who are experiencing those kinds of loyalty conflicts become less close to both, too, right, over time. So it's not like it's going to be a better outcome. Yeah. So, okay, what are the impacts? Let's get to that. I'll hold questions. I'll answer some more questions. I deliberately left time in the end for time, so we can do that. All right. So, so let's look at. I did measure several mental health outcomes in this study, all 3 studies. So first we looked at post-traumatic stress and traumatic stress symptoms, and we found statistically significant differences for parents who were feeling like they were being alienated or the targets of alienating behaviors compared to parents who were not, and compared to people in the general population who don't have children. So we found that they had much higher PTSD symptoms. You can see that. I'm sorry, the general population is very faint, but they're on the right. The blue is the alienated parents. We also found the same effect in our third poll, and we found that the more alienated the parent was from their child using the Rowland's measure, the more symptoms that they had. And likewise, we found for depression or depressive symptoms, we found that parents who were the targets of alienating behaviors had higher levels of depression than people who were not being alienated and people who did not have children. And in the third poll, it was the parents who were moderately to severely alienated who had significantly higher depressive symptoms as well compared to parents who were not. And even more disturbing are the findings related to suicide using the third poll. And we use Rowland's measure, and we found that the more alienated a parent is, the more likely they are to have considered suicide in the last year. And then we compared these parents to other, we compared the alienating parents to the targeted parents to the reciprocating parents. And we asked them whether their thoughts of suicide were related to child custody issues or conflict with their ex. And targeted parents were more likely to say that this was the case than the other parents. You can see that on the orange or the yellow bar is the targeted parents, saying that their thoughts of suicide were related to their behavior or the behaviors of the other person and the outcomes with their children. And then finally, and most concerning, I think, is among the parents who were moderately to severely alienated, almost half had considered suicide in the last year. And of these parents, almost 20% knew of someone else who had committed suicide over conflict with their ex or custody issues with their child. And so for parents who are already vulnerable, they are witnessing other people seeking escape through suicide, which poses additional risk for acting on their feelings. And this is a topic of a grant proposal I'm working on right now, where we're going to try to understand this a little bit better and find ways to intervene. So we measured a lot of other things, but I don't have time to talk about it. Good timing. But what can we take away from all these statistics? There's a lot of, I threw a lot up here at you, and the paper has even more. So if you want more details, I can share that paper with you. But I think we can kind of more confidently say that about 22 million parents using different measures feel like they're being alienated. And we're using different measures and different types of sampling methods, and we're kind of coming closer to that fact, and I feel more confident in that number. We also came close to estimates that made by others like Bill Burnett and Rick Warshak that about 1.3% of children are moderately to severely alienated from a parent here in the U.S. And that's assuming that there's only one child in each family, so it could be more. And chances are it's probably twice that number, I'd estimate, or close to it. And although I didn't report this earlier, there were no demographic differences among people in the sample. And we sampled by education, gender, race, ethnicity, education, income. So we looked at all of that. So moms and dads, whites, blacks, Asians, high, low income, alienation is not discriminating. Okay. Finally, and we can look at reciprocity. We didn't find support for the idea that when children are alienated, both parents must be engaging in these behaviors. And I know that when we talk about hybrid models, hybrid is kind of used, and it's hard to know whether it's including people who are being abusive or if it's including people that people are just saying they're both acting badly. So I think we kind of need to be more clear about what that is, I think, in the literature. But we're finding, at least for people who are reciprocating behaviors, that they're not likely to be alienated as much as the parents who are the primary victims of this. And it does reflect, I think, especially in the other work that I'm researching right now, is power differentials between parents. Because when we understand this kind of family violence as what I think it is more intimate terrorism, we see these power imbalances. And so you see a parent who's a primary victim of these behaviors, and this data supports that. And finally, we found that, across all three polls, that the mental health impact on targeted parents is severe, especially when we compare it to other parents who are divorced and have children and other people who don't even have children. Higher levels of trauma, greater depression, and we're more suicidal. Now, this should be hopefully alarming. I'm sure it's not probably surprising to many of you in the room, but I think it's a serious call for action to dedicate more funding to understanding this and to develop some interventions, because we have many children who are at risk of losing a parent because of not only through alienation but through suicide because of the egregious behaviors of the alienating parent. So on that note, I'm on time and I have time for questions. So I think maybe a couple minutes, like a minute or two. No, I can take one question.